I'm going to start this presentation by taking you to one of the really great works of classical scholarship of the last century, E.R. Dodd's book, The Greeks and the Irrational. He begins it by recounting the day he was in the British Museum in London, looking at the sculptures from the Parthenon, and there was approached by a young man who said to him, "I know it's an awful thing to confess, but this Greek stuff doesn't move me one bit." And Dodds, being the very thoughtful man that he was, didn't just brush this aside, but began to really delve deeper. And he said, "Well, why?" And the fellow said, "It's all so terribly rational, if you know what I mean." And Dodds reflected that there is that air that the study of the Greek legacy has for us, that we think of Plato and Aristotle, of philosophy, of marble sculptures. We forget the fact that those white marble sculptures that we see in museums actually were painted. They looked a little bit more like real people, or at least they had the colors that suggested living things. Right there is a very interesting anomaly. But the point that he raises is a question that we've dealt with throughout the term, which is the really wondrous way that Greek mythology, as much as it has become part of a classical heritage, also invites us to look deeply, as Dodds puts it, to penetrate to the deeper, less conscious levels of human experience. For that reason, we've looked quite a bit at the works of Walter Burkert, who invites us not just to read the classical stories and all their literary brilliance, but to delve like archaeologists to the deeper level of human experience that is hidden within those stories. And of course, when we step back and think, even the greatest monuments of Greek tragedy, the Oresteia, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, and the plays of Euripides, even there we do see the attempt to understand, to unpack and unravel those darker passions within the human experience. There is no figure in Greek mythology that invites us to probe to those deeper, less conscious levels of human experience than that of the god Dionysus. You may tend to think of him as jolly Bacchus, wine cup in hand, a bunch of grapes in the other, but the figure of Dionysus is a far more complex, far more primitive figure from which the literary and artistic figures will ultimately grow. And here, as E.R. Dodds puts it so well, were the Greeks in fact quite so blind to the importance of non-rational factors in man's experience and behavior as is commonly assumed both by their apologists and by their critics? And the answer is clearly no. And their awareness of this and the way they confront it is in fact one of the aspects of their brilliance. Dionysus is a very ancient god. There are theories within the world of Greek mythology that suggest that he was an import from the East, and there are reasons for that. In the myths we hear about the transport, the travel of Dionysus and his followers from the East. But he does appear in those Linear B tablets, those most ancient specimens we have of Greek, going all the way back to the 12th century. And here I've transcribed and translated one of them, the wine of Dionysus. Clearly that's our god, and he's going all the way back to the very earliest level of written Greek. I hasten to add that the Linear B tablets are not written in the Greek alphabet as we know it. That doesn't really enter into Greek consciousness until several centuries later. But in this strange script, which took so long to decipher, we do see these recognizable Greek words. Dionysus, the wine of Dionysus. I invite you to look at some of the patterns that we see in the myths surrounding Dionysus. And certainly the first group is one that is intimately part of the Bacchae of Euripides, the tragedy that you're studying. The children of Cadmus are Ino, Autonoe, Semele, and Agave. And all of them have a rather unwholesome history around them. Agave, you will recall, is the mother of Pentheus. And in the tragedy, she will be one of the maddened followers of Bacchus, one of the Maenads, who tears her son apart, the sparagmos, as it's called in the ritual. Semele, you will recall, was the mother of Dionysus, and she made the mistake of demanding that Zeus appear to her in Epiphany, and is burned up in his Epiphany. The baby Dionysus is rescued from her womb, and Ino, we're going to look at. Ino rears the infant Dionysus, but her husband Athamas grows mad and hunts down one son, Learchus, as if he's some kind of animal, and Ino jumps into the sea with another child, Melicertes, to avoid Athamas. It's a pretty unhappy family. And Autonoe had a son called Actaeon, whom you will remember was the poor hunter who came upon Artemis naked in one version of the myth, the later version, and is torn apart by his dogs that Artemis sets upon him. In another version of the story, he is a rival to Zeus for Semele's affection. Another group of sisters, the daughters of Minyas, Leucippe, Arsinoe, and Alcathoe, refuse to worship Dionysus. He drives them mad. They have a sparagmos. They tear apart one of the children, Hippasus, and the women are turned into bats. We're going to look at the Orphic myths soon, where we'll find the story of Zagreus, which is sometimes an alternative name for Dionysus, and Zagreus is dismembered and reborn. We're seeing an unfortunate history here of child murder, of the ripping apart of a child, and all of these things are going to be woven into the story of the Bacchae, as you have seen. You recall the story of the birth of Dionysus. Zeus is grief-stricken that his child is in the womb of Semele, who's died when he appeared in Epiphany. So he takes the child, the unborn child, sews it into his thigh, and little Dionysus is born right from his thigh, and that's depicted here on this Greek vase. The early exploits of Dionysus show the same pattern that we saw with the daughters of Cadmus. King Lycurgus persecutes him, and so he's struck mad by Dionysus, and he chops up his son. Lycurgus himself is executed by being pulled apart by horses. We hear about the Argive women offending Dionysus, who then grow mad and eat their infants. I'm emphasizing this point because, as you know from the Bacchae, it is a central part of the story, and I would like you to consider how much the cultic elements of the rituals of Dionysus, and the older, rather ghastly myths all are woven into the way Euripides frames the story and the interactions of the characters. One of the charming legends about Dionysus is that he was kidnapped by pirates who just wouldn't take his word for it, that he was a rather special entity. And so he turns them all into dolphins. And here in this magnificent vase painting by Exekias, we see the god sitting in the boat. He's made a vine to grow over him for shade and comfort. And the dolphins are swimming around his boat. Dionysus is, of course, a god of transformations. In this case, he's turning the pirates into dolphins. In other places, we're going to see the way he himself is transformed into an animal. Perhaps one of the most chilling lines in all of Greek tragedy, when the stranger, who just claims to be a Dionysiac leader, actually the god in disguise, says to Pentheus, "You do not know what your life is, what you're doing, or who you are." That is the quintessence of what's underlying the whole cult and myth of Dionysus, the ability to understand more deeply, to be able to stand out from one's everyday existence. Ecstasis, from which we get our word ecstasy, is that standing out from our normal ability to see and to act. In 1969, there was a rather famous, I should say notorious, restaging of the Bacchae, and I rather like this line, "Ecstasy does not come cheap." And obviously for readers of the Bacchae, you can see that it comes at the cost of enormous suffering. And Dionysus, is of course a god of the theater. Here is the archaeological site in Athens, right by the Acropolis, the great theater of Dionysus, where the tragedies and comedies were performed. Dionysus, of course, is the figure that changes roles, changes shapes, and not surprisingly, the theater is done in masks, capturing that element of disguise and the changing of role and persona. He can appear in many different animal forms. In one of the myths, Zeus turns Dionysus into a kid, into a little goat, and he lives in disguise in Asia. In the Homeric hymn to Dionysus, he turns into a lion, which terrifies the pirates on board that ship, so they jump over and become dolphins. And in the Bacchae, remember that he is often seen as a bull. The bull is quintessential to the myths and rituals of Dionysus. Notice this hymn that Plutarch recounts for us. The women in celebrating Dionysus sing, "O worthy bull, come with your bull foots hasting." So they're actually envisioning him in that particular shape. He has strong plant associations. In that Homeric hymn to Dionysus, we see him as ivy, we see him associated with the vine. And here the Near Eastern influence is likely to be very, very apposite and relevant. In the Ugaritic myth of Akat the hunter, he's killed by the drunken Yatpan, notice drunk, and his blood flows like sap and is eaten. Then the body is pieced back together, as it reads, "She ate his flesh without a knife, she drank his blood without a cup." Again, we see something that looks much like the sparagmos element in the Dionysiac cult, about which we'll talk in a moment. And clearly, the idea of the god of wine being eaten in the form of grapes or even more so wine really connects that Near Eastern version with what we see in Greek mythology. And Plutarch notes this very strong plant connection. He's gladsome Dionysus who renews the world of trees. In other words, a god who has everything to do with fertility and fecundity as well. His female followers are called Maenads, and we have depictions on Greek vases and literary descriptions that tell us a lot about what they would have looked like, and I am going to argue historically what they looked like, not just in myth and art. The head is thrown back. They carry a wand called the thyrsus. We're going to see some pictures of that in a moment. They really do look like they're in convulsion. The eyes are rolling. They shout. They're often accompanied by satyrs, these half-man, half-beast figures, usually sexually aroused, and sexuality does seem to be a major part of the myths, and we see that so much, of course, with Dionysus in all of his mythology. All these elements are going to appear in Euripides' Bacchae. They can be gentle, modest, and sober. They can be kind to animals. They can have magic control of nature. They carry the thyrsus. They dance on the mountains. They split into three companies. And they do a sparagmos, the horrible dismemberment of Pentheus. Here we have a rather demure-looking Maenad. She's dressed nicely, she's wearing some jewelry, and she's carrying a thyrsus. That is not the way we'll see them in so many depictions of art, and most assuredly not in the literary description within the Bacchae. And here we have something that is a little bit more of an insight into the wildness. This Maenad has a snake in her hair, and she's carrying a wild animal by the foot. In her left hand, in her right, she holds the thyrsus. And here the Maenad in ecstasy, throwing her head back on this wild, almost convulsive posture, which is typical of Maenadic behavior. In this fascinating scene, we see a Maenad who is resisting the advance of a sexually aroused satyr. Notice in a posture that could only be described as mediation, her thyrsus, with which she's striking this satyr in the genitals, is itself so much of a phallic implement that we really are seeing a remarkable crossing of the lines here of gender and persona. And the phallic cult is very evident in the rituals and the myths of Dionysus. One of the festivals of Dionysus, the Pitcher Festival, the Koes Festival, features, not surprisingly, as a part of the ritual of rude jokes. And as I mentioned before, the thyrsus is suggestively shaped, and in that vase painting that we just saw, very suggestively used. Dionysus is a god who disappears and comes back. One of his rituals involves a procession with a ship. In the myths from Asia, he's turned into a kid. He lives overseas. There's a procession into the theater of Dionysus, and remember that Everything is done there in masks. And his worship involves retreats of the women into the mountains, going and coming back, and revelation, which is to say, epiphany. He has underworld associations. The pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus identified him with Hades. How interesting. And one of his cultic epithets, Melanigus, is also an epithet of the Furies of the Erinues. And on the last day of the Pitcher Festival, it's an ill-omened day of ghosts. The women chew buckthorn, rather foul-smelling stuff, and they anoint the doors with pitch. All of this suggests a rather unworldly underworld association. So now we come to the really big question. Did it happen? Were there actually examples of women dressing as Maenads, going out from their staid existence into the mountains, tearing animals apart? I am going to suggest strongly yes. And it gives us an enormous insight into Greek civilization to understand that. Already in the Iliad, we hear of Andromache rushing through the palace like a Maenad. So Homer is capturing this part that women can act in this Maenadic state. He uses that as a comparison. But we learn from the 2nd century author Pausanias that every other year the women go to Mount Parnassus and celebrate orgies in honor of Dionysus. And there they hold their dances. So certainly in the 2nd century of our era, we've got a very sober Greek source telling us that these festivals actually happen. But how wild were they? Let's look a little deeper. In this Greek vase painting, in which the Maenads are presenting a little animal to Dionysus, one might well say, okay, mythological. But let's look a little deeper. In this vase painting, which again one could perhaps say is mythological because there's a satyr there, we find a Maenad who's torn a little deer apart, rather gruesome. Another one is holding a snake. And here we see that same treatment being meted out to Pentheus from your story. Now, of course, this vase is dated 490 BCE, and Euripides wrote the Bacchae at the end of the 5th century. So this legend's been around for a while. And here another depiction of the sparagmos, the tearing apart of Pentheus. This one from the middle of the 5th century, again, long before Euripides wrote the Bacchae. This was deeply embedded into Greek mythological thought. And here, in vivid detail, from a fresco in Pompeii, which, as you remember, was the Roman city covered up in the eruption of Vesuvius. So let's get back to the question, did it happen? Porphyry, writing in the 3rd century, recounts in Chios and Tenedos, they sacrificed a man to Dionysus the raw eater after they had torn him into pieces. I have some doubts about that. I have less doubt about this inscription from the 3rd century BCE. Whenever the priestess performs the holy rites, it is not permitted for anyone to throw the animals to be eaten raw, homophagion, before the priestess has thrown them in on behalf of the city. In other words, an organized sparagmos and raw eating. That really does invite us to recognize that there's something here at the very heart of Greek civilization, a confrontation with something that seems really quite awful. Assuming that that is true, we then ask ourselves why. What is the advantage of that? Some scholars have suggested that the element of release that comes from doing something that is to us, is to normal people, and I put the Greeks in that category, on the edge, on the margins, rather repulsive, is kind of a safety valve. It's a great release. What would somebody have felt after that ritual, tearing apart an animal, eating raw flesh? Maybe very ready to return to the norms of civilization. So I leave you with that thought. What I mostly want you to be able to do is look at the Bacchae of Euripides as a literary retelling of something with some very, very old, deep, primitive cultic roots, and see the way he turns that into a drama that is both human and mythological. So in summary, what do we have with Dionysus? A god of wine and inebriation. We see that already, the association of Dionysus and wine in the Linear B tablet. And remember the dictum of the anthropologist that the superego is soluble in alcohol. In other words, people find in alcohol the ability to leave themselves and their constraints behind. That is another way of looking at ecstasy, standing out from that normal existence. In the theater, the actors wear masks, they leave their identity. He's a god who can cross boundaries. He departs and he comes back. He participates in quite a bit of sexual release, and the thyrsus is that very strong phallic emblem, and he can change his identity with the animal, sometimes indeed suggesting that he is himself his own ritual victim. So I leave you to ponder this remarkable figure from Greek mythology, not just mythology, but Greek cultic practice, and to go back and think about what E.R. Dodds asked us to consider, the Greek embrace under very particular conditions, but the Greek embrace nonetheless of the irrational, not trying to wipe it out or repress it, but to try to find ways to confront it and to deal with it in a way that is perhaps a little safer than what happens when people refuse to confront the fact that within all of us is something of the irrational.